All ancient DNA studies involve, big teams of folks. So I've been lucky enough to work with a big team to study back in 2019 the genetic history of Rome. So we put together a time transect to sort of track the rise and fall of Rome and the people moving into. And
in 2019, a new chapter in the history of Italy began with something almost invisible, a sequence of ancient DNA appearing on a computer screen. Researchers were no longer relying only on pottery, inscriptions, burial customs, architecture, or the writings of ancient historians. They were beginning to read the genomes of people who had died thousands of years earlier. Among the most revealing material came from ancient individuals buried in and around Rome, with samples reaching back through thousands of years of Italian prehistory. The expectation was relatively straightforward. If modern Italians were largely the descendants of the ancient populations who had inhabited the peninsula through the Roman period, then the genetic record should show a long thread of continuity. There should be change, certainly, but mostly a recognizable biological population gradually absorbing newcomers. Instead, ancient DNA began revealing something far more complicated. Italy's genetic history was not a single, uninterrupted story. It was a sequence of migrations, replacements, bottlenecks, expansions, and regional separations that repeatedly transformed the people living on the peninsula. The result was a discovery with implications far beyond Italy, because it challenged one of the most intuitive assumptions in human history, that the people living in a place today must be, in a relatively straightforward way, the descendants of the people who lived there thousands of years ago. For much of the 20th century, however, there was no practical way to test that assumption directly. Archaeologists reconstructed Italian history through material remains. Linguists followed the movement of languages. Historians relied on inscriptions and surviving ancient texts. From this evidence, a coherent picture emerged. Modern Italy appeared to be the product of an ancient population divided into recognizable regional groups. Latin-speaking Romans dominated central Italy and eventually created one of the most powerful states in history. The Etruscans occupied much of central and northern Italy and spoke a language that remains only partially understood. Greek settlers established colonies across southern Italy and Sicily beginning in the 8th century BCE, creating the region the Romans later called Magna Graecia. Celtic and other populations occupied parts of northern Italy, particularly the Po Valley. Then, centuries later, Germanic groups such as the Lombards entered the peninsula after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. From this archaeological and historical framework, it was tempting to imagine modern Italians as the biological descendants of these ancient populations, with later invasions adding relatively thin cultural layers over an otherwise stable genetic foundation. Northern Italians could be associated with ancient Celtic and Germanic populations, Southern Italians with Greeks and pre-Roman Italic peoples, and Sardinians with an unusually isolated island population. The story was elegant because it seemed to connect geography, archaeology, language, and modern identity into one continuous chain. The problem was that nobody could look directly into the genomes of the people who had lived through these transformations. That limitation mattered enormously. Before ancient DNA became practical, population geneticists were effectively working backward from the present. They could collect blood samples from modern Italians, compare genetic markers between regions, and then attempt to reconstruct what populations might have looked like thousands of years earlier. But modern genetic similarity can conceal radically different histories. Imagine two populations that are genetically similar today. One might have remained in the same region for thousands of years, gradually mixing with neighboring groups. The other might have experienced several major migrations and population replacements before eventually arriving at a similar genetic composition. If all you possess is the modern endpoint, separating those two histories can be extremely difficult. Early mitochondrial DNA studies added another layer of uncertainty. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited primarily through the maternal line, passing from mothers to their children and therefore preserving only one narrow pathway through a person's ancestry. In the early 2000s, researchers studying mitochondrial variation in modern populations found similarities between Tuscans and populations from the Eastern Mediterranean and Anatolia. In 2007, such findings were interpreted by some as potentially supporting the ancient account of Herodotus, who had written centuries earlier that the Etruscans had migrated from Lydia in what is now Western Turkey. The idea was captivating. Perhaps an ancient historian had preserved a memory of a real migration, and modern genetics had finally found the biological evidence to support it. But there was a fundamental problem. Mitochondrial DNA represents only a tiny fraction of the ancestry contained within a human genome. It follows one maternal line while ignoring the enormous number of ancestral lines inherited through fathers and the countless other branches of a family tree. It was a signal, but it was not the whole population history. The breakthrough came with the development of increasingly reliable methods for recovering ancient DNA from archaeological remains. One of the most important locations for this work is the petrous portion of the temporal bone, a dense structure of the skull located near the inner ear. Its remarkable mineral density can protect fragments of DNA long after softer tissues and many other bones have deteriorated. That discovery transformed ancient population genetics. Suddenly, researchers could begin asking a fundamentally different question. Instead of looking at modern Italians and trying to infer the past, what if they could simply retrieve DNA from the people who actually lived in that past? By the late 2000s and 10s, improvements in extraction, sequencing, and computational analysis were making it possible to study ancient genomes at a scale that had been unimaginable only a generation earlier. In 2019, researchers published major work examining ancient genomes associated with the city of Rome and central Italy, helping establish a much more detailed genetic timeline. Instead of seeing a single population gradually evolving in place, researchers began seeing distinct genetic phases. Hunter-gatherers were followed by farmers. Later, populations carrying ancestry associated with the Eurasian steppe appeared. Iron Age communities emerged from these earlier transformations. And then, the Roman imperial period introduced another dramatic demographic shift. The genetic record was beginning to resemble an archaeological excavation in which every layer contained evidence of a different population history. The first major transformation had begun thousands of years before Rome existed. Modern humans had occupied the Italian peninsula for tens of thousands of years, and during the Ice Age, Italy served as one of the important refuges where human populations survived periods of severe climatic instability. These hunter-gatherers lived in a world radically different from the agricultural societies that would later dominate Europe. They moved through landscapes in search of game and wild plants, adapted to changing environments, and maintained relatively small populations. Then, beginning around the 7th millennium BCE, farming communities with ancestry ultimately connected to Anatolia and the Near East expanded into Europe. They brought domesticated plants, livestock, new settlement patterns, and a radically different economic system. In Italy, early agricultural communities appeared first in the south and southeastern regions, before farming spread farther across the peninsula. The transition was not simply a technological revolution, it was also a demographic transformation. As farmers expanded, they mixed with existing hunter-gatherer communities, but in many regions, the genetic contribution of the earlier populations declined dramatically. The people who had occupied Europe since the Ice Age were not simply transformed culturally. In many places, they were substantially replaced or absorbed by incoming agricultural populations. Sardinia became one of the great exceptions. Its geographic isolation limited the impact of later migrations, allowing a larger proportion of the ancestry associated with early European farmers to survive. That is why modern Sardinians remain genetically distinctive and preserve ancestry that provides an extraordinary window into Europe's Neolithic past. But the Neolithic transformation was only the beginning. Several thousand years later, another population movement entered the European story from a completely different direction. During the late 4th and 3rd millennia BCE, populations carrying ancestry related to the Pontic-Caspian steppe expanded westward into Europe. Archaeologists associate some of these movements with the spread of cultural complexes, such as the Yamnaya horizon and, later, the Bell-Beaker phenomenon. Ancient DNA revealed that these were not merely changes in pottery styles or trading networks. They involved substantial movements of people. Steppe-related ancestry spread across large parts of Europe, sometimes dramatically changing the genetic composition of populations within only a few centuries. In Italy, the process was more gradual and regionally uneven than in some parts of northern Europe. Northern and central regions absorbed steppe-related ancestry earlier and more strongly, while southern Italy and especially Sardinia followed different trajectories. Yet by the Bronze and Iron Ages, the population of the Italian peninsula had already been transformed by multiple waves of migration and admixture. This was long before the traditional founding of Rome in 753 BCE. It meant that even the populations later remembered as the ancestors of the Romans were themselves the product of earlier demographic changes. By the beginning of the Iron Age, Italy was therefore not a genetically uniform population waiting to become Roman. It was a mosaic of communities shaped by different histories of migration, isolation, trade, and intermarriage. This is where the Etruscan question becomes particularly fascinating. The Etruscans emerged as one of the dominant cultures of central Italy during the first millennium BCE. Their language was different from Latin and from the other Indo-European languages spoken across much of Europe. Their religious traditions, monumental tombs, artistic styles, and political organization gave them a distinct cultural identity. Ancient writers, especially Herodotus, offered explanations for their origins that connected them with Anatolia. For generations, scholars debated whether this reflected an actual migration from the eastern Mediterranean. Ancient DNA finally offered a way to test the question. Instead of revealing a population recently transplanted from Anatolia, genomic studies found that Etruscan individuals were broadly similar to their neighboring Italic populations. Their ancestry reflected the same deep layers of European, Neolithic farmer and steppe-related ancestry found among other populations of central Italy. The result was profoundly important because it demonstrated that cultural identity and biological ancestry do not necessarily move together. A population can speak a completely different language, worship different gods, practice different burial customs, and construct a distinct civilization while remaining genetically similar to its neighbors. The Etruscan case became a warning against assuming that a cultural difference must represent a corresponding biological difference. And then came Rome. The city that would eventually dominate the Mediterranean did not remain genetically isolated from the world it conquered. Quite the opposite happened. As Rome expanded during the Republic and then transformed into an empire under Augustus in the late 1st century BCE, enormous numbers of people moved across the Mediterranean. Military campaigns brought soldiers from distant provinces. Trade connected Rome with North Africa, Greece, Anatolia, the Levant, Egypt, and beyond. Enslaved people were transported into Italy, while freed people, merchants, administrators, craftsmen, and families followed the economic opportunities created by imperial expansion. By the 1st centuries CE, Rome had become one of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities in the ancient world. Ancient DNA suggests that this transformation was reflected directly in the city's population. Individuals buried in imperial-era Rome increasingly carried ancestry associated with the Eastern Mediterranean. The genetic profile of the capital began moving away from the populations that had lived in central Italy during the preceding Iron Age. In other words, Rome did not simply conquer the Eastern Mediterranean. The Eastern Mediterranean came to Rome. The political boundaries of the empire created demographic connections powerful enough to reshape the biological composition of the capital itself. That discovery changes the way the Roman world should be imagined. The Roman Empire was not a civilization populated by a genetically fixed group of people who simply imposed their culture on everyone else. It was a massive demographic network in which people were constantly moving, mixing, marrying, serving in armies, trading goods, and building new lives far from their places of origin. By the height of imperial power, the population of Rome could include people whose ancestors had lived thousands of kilometers away, only a few generations earlier. The genetic evidence therefore reveals a paradox at the heart of Roman history. Rome created institutions, laws, roads, languages, and political traditions that survived long after the empire itself disappeared. Yet the population living inside those institutions was continuously changing. The people who lived in imperial Rome were not genetically identical to the people who had lived in Rome during the early Republic. The city remained Rome, the monuments remained Rome, and the political identity remained Roman. But the biological population had been transformed by the very empire that made Rome powerful. When the Western Roman Empire fragmented during the 5th century CE, the demographic story did not stop. New migrations reshaped parts of the peninsula again. In 568 CE, the Lombards entered Italy from the north, establishing a kingdom that would eventually control large portions of northern and central Italy and several territories farther south. Ancient DNA from Lombard-era burials has provided evidence that this movement involved genuine population migration, including families, rather than being solely a small military elite taking control of an existing population. But geography, once again, mattered. Lombard power never covered the entire peninsula. Byzantine territories remained in parts of Italy, and Sardinia, much of Sicily, Calabria, and other southern regions followed different historical trajectories. This uneven political history helped preserve regional genetic differences. Northern and central Italy experienced additional northern European input, while southern regions retained stronger connections with the Eastern Mediterranean. Sicily added yet another layer through centuries of interaction with Greek, Roman, Byzantine, Arab, and Norman populations. By the medieval period, Italy was already carrying the accumulated genetic signatures of prehistoric farmers, steppe populations, Iron Age communities, Greek colonists, Roman-era migrants, Germanic groups, and later Mediterranean populations. The most important lesson from this history is not that one population replaced another in a simple sequence. It is that the Italian peninsula became a living archive of repeated demographic change. The modern genetic landscape contains traces of events separated by thousands of years. The farmers who arrived during the Neolithic left descendants. Steppe-related populations contributed another layer. Greek settlers and local Italic populations mixed in the south. Roman expansion connected Italy with distant regions of the Mediterranean. Germanic migrations added another component after the collapse of imperial rule. Later, medieval migrations added still more. Some layers became diluted, others survived strongly in particular regions, and some remained surprisingly concentrated in isolated populations such as Sardinians. The result is that modern Italian genetic diversity cannot be explained by a single ancient population or a single migration. It is the cumulative product of thousands of years of movement. And that is why ancient DNA has changed the story so dramatically. Archaeology can tell us that a new pottery tradition appeared. Historical texts can tell us that an army invaded. Languages can reveal that populations interacted. But genomes can sometimes show whether people themselves moved, whether communities were replaced, whether newcomers mixed with locals, and how quickly those changes occurred. A fragment of bone can preserve evidence of demographic events that no ancient writer ever recorded. The deeper researchers dig into the Italian genetic record, the less convincing the idea of a single, uninterrupted biological identity becomes. Italy was never simply one population. It was a succession of populations, connected by migration and separated by geography, repeatedly transformed by people arriving from somewhere else. The mystery, then, is not that Italians have a hidden ancestry. The mystery is how many layers of ancestry can exist inside a population that appears, from the outside, to have one continuous historical identity. The Romans imagined themselves as Romans. The Etruscans understood themselves as Etruscans. Greek colonists founded cities that became part of the Italian landscape. Lombards created kingdoms that eventually disappeared. Centuries later, modern Italians inherited fragments of all these histories without necessarily knowing which parts survived inside their genomes. What ancient DNA has revealed is that ancestry is not a straight line. It is a constantly branching network of migrations, encounters, disappearances, and survivals. And when scientists read the genomes of people who died thousands of years ago, they are not merely reconstructing the past. They are discovering how much of that past is still alive inside the people of the present. The story, therefore, does not begin with Rome, and it does not end with Rome. It begins tens of thousands of years earlier, with hunter-gatherers surviving the Ice Age, continues through the arrival of Anatolian farmers, the expansion of steppe-related populations, the rise of Etruscan and Italic cultures, the explosive demographic expansion of the Roman Empire, and the migrations that followed its collapse. Layer after layer was added to the peninsula, and almost none of those layers disappeared completely. The genetic record of modern Italy is therefore less like a single-family tree and more like an archaeological site. Dig down, and another population appears. Dig deeper, and another migration emerges. Go back far enough, and the neat historical categories begin to dissolve. What looked like a continuous Italian story turns out to be a 12,000-year sequence of human movements, biological transformations, and cultural identities repeatedly rebuilding themselves on top of what came before. And that is where the first layer of the story begins. Long before Rome had a name, long before Latin was spoken, and long before the Italian peninsula was divided into kingdoms and nations, humans were already living across this landscape. Modern humans reached Italy roughly 45,000 years ago, and during the last glacial maximum, when enormous ice sheets covered much of northern Europe, the peninsula became one of the important refugia where human populations survived the cold. These hunter-gatherers were highly mobile, deeply adapted to their environments, and capable of surviving in landscapes that would have been almost unrecognizable to modern eyes. For thousands of years, their descendants occupied the peninsula. Then, around the 7th millennium BCE, the first great demographic rupture arrived. Neolithic farmers, ultimately tracing much of their ancestry to Anatolia and the Near East, began expanding into Europe, bringing domesticated wheat, sheep, cattle, new settlement patterns, and an entirely different way of life. In Italy, some of the earliest farming communities appeared in Puglia on the southeastern coast, before agricultural populations expanded northward, along the Adriatic, and westward toward the Tyrrhenian coast. This was not simply the spread of an idea. Ancient DNA shows that it was also a movement of people. Within several centuries, the genetic contribution of earlier hunter-gatherers had declined substantially in many regions. Populations that had survived the Ice Age were absorbed, displaced, or genetically overwhelmed by incoming farming communities. One of the clearest exceptions was Sardinia. Separated from mainland Italy by the Mediterranean and relatively protected from many later population movements, the island preserved an unusually strong Neolithic genetic signal. Modern Sardinians remain among the closest living European populations to the early farmers who spread across Europe thousands of years ago. In that sense, Sardinia became something extraordinary, a genetic time capsule surrounded by blue water. When researchers study the genomes of modern Sardinians, they can see echoes of a Europe that existed roughly 6,000 years ago, before another transformation began. That next transformation came from an entirely different direction. Beginning roughly 5,000 years ago, populations carrying ancestry associated with the Pontic-Caspian steppe began expanding westward across Europe. Ancient DNA has shown that these migrations were far more consequential than archaeologists once realized. They were not simply cultural influences spreading through trade. In many regions, they represented substantial movements of people. During the Bronze Age, steppe-related ancestry eventually reached Italy, with evidence indicating its presence in northern Italy by around 2000 BCE and farther south in central Italy by approximately 1600 BCE. One archaeological context associated with this transformation was the Bell Beaker cultural phenomenon, recognized by its distinctive pottery, metalworking traditions, and wide geographic distribution. The people associated with these movements were connected to pastoral communities of the Eurasian grasslands, where mobile herding, horse transport, and new metallurgical technologies were becoming increasingly important. Their arrival also coincided with one of the most consequential linguistic transformations in European prehistory. Steppe-related populations are strongly associated with the spread of Indo-European languages, the language family that would eventually include Latin, Greek, Germanic languages, Celtic languages, Slavic languages, and many others. Across parts of northern Europe, steppe ancestry became extraordinarily prominent within only a few centuries. Italy followed a more complicated path. Geography divided the peninsula into regions that absorbed the new ancestry at different speeds and intensities. The north experienced the change earlier and more strongly, while the south remained more connected to older Mediterranean populations. Sardinia, once again, remained comparatively isolated. By the time Rome was traditionally founded in 753 BCE, populations in central Italy already carried a significant component of steppe-related ancestry. In other words, the people who would eventually become Romans had already experienced one enormous genetic transformation before Rome itself had begun to dominate the peninsula. Two major demographic upheavals had occurred over roughly 4,000 years, and the biological population of Italy had already been rewritten more than once before the foundations of the Colosseum were ever imagined.